Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabes here. This is the Heroic DPS guide for Kor'kron Dark Shaman. And this video should assist DPS players with all the basics you'll need to know to get through this encounter on Heroic difficulty. Now first up, there are new abilities on Heroic. So the first of these is from Haromm, and this is Iron Tomb. So if you look on the top left, you can see some sort of earthen smoke. This is Iron Tomb spawning, and when this is cast, it targets up to 3 players outside of melee range, but always a minimum of 1 player. And when it appears, you have 3 seconds to get out of melee range of it. If you're still at the location it spawns, it'll do 500,000 damage to you. So if you're near Haromm, the best thing you can do is simply watch for the spawn timer, and when it appears, if it's under you, step away from it a few yards. Once the tomb has appeared, you're safe to move back into melee range of it. It won't harm you after that. The other new ability is from Kardris, which is Iron Prison. This will target 2 random players. Anyone except a tank is valid. So if it targets you, you'll have a 60-second debuff, and when that debuff expires, you will take 100% of your health in damage. So this is one of the most important abilities to worry about as a DPS on this fight. Make sure you have a clear indication of when you have Iron Prison on you. I'll try to include a link in the description to the weak aura that I'm using to remind myself of it. But when it expires, use a personal damage reduction cooldown of some kind. If you're full health and you have any form of damage reduction cooldown, you will survive it. And that's the main goal here. It can target you every 60 seconds if you get targeted back to back. So just be aware that you'll need something every 60 seconds at most, but usually not that frequently, depending how many players you have involved in this section of the fight. So there you can see the weak aura pop up on the left that I made. And that will just, like I said, indicate when it's expiring, so you know when to use a personal cooldown. This is the most important thing as a DPS that you're not going to be used to on Heroic difficulty, or from normal difficulty rather. Now there are a couple strategies that raids will use for this encounter, but for this video I'm going to assume you're using the split method, which is what you see in the video here. Essentially this involves splitting the bosses apart from one another for the majority of the fight, so that abilities from Kardris do not affect players on Haromm and vice versa. So that's what you see here. Clearly I'm in the Kardris group, where the majority of the raid will be, and usually all DPS will be as well. That said, it's possible that you will be assigned as a DPS to the Haromm group, and if that's the case, there are a few things to know. The first is simply that you have to deal with Iron Tomb spawns, so make sure you know clearly when that's spawning, and if you're a DPS, especially a ranged, it's going to spawn under you. So make sure you're aware of when it's appearing, and then just step out of its location, as I talked about before. The other main thing is Toxic Mist. This will do heavy damage to you as a DPS. So you will not be targeted by Iron Prison, of course, but Toxic Mist will require, or should, I should say, indicate that you want to use a personal cooldown. So if you're on Haromm as a DPS, when you get Toxic Mist, especially near the end of its duration, try to use a personal cooldown if possible. It will be on you most of the time if you're up there, however, so you cannot cool down the entire, or every time it's cast on you. Finally, Foul Stream, if it targets you, make sure you step to the side so that it doesn't hit anyone else that's up there on Haromm. But generally speaking, as I said, most of the time DPS will be assigned to Kardris, so generally you will not need to worry about Haromm's abilities. Now on the flip side, if you are assigned to Kardris, which you will most likely be if you're using a split method, then everything is pretty much the same as it is on normal difficulty, just ramped up a bit. With the exception of the Iron Prison, which we talked about already, the main thing to concern yourself with is your positioning relative to the boss and how that affects Toxic Storm spawns. So it will depend a bit on your raid strategy, but you can see here the method we use, which worked really well, was to stack up everyone in melee range of the boss pretty much at all times. By doing this, you force the Toxic Storm to spawn on that location, and once she starts casting it, everyone runs out in the same direction, and if you run quickly enough, you will not take any damage from the Toxic Storm, but this will allow you to ensure that the spawn location is always the same. By splitting the mobs up, if you use a split method, you won't have to deal with any of Haromm's abilities, so the only incidental damage that's outside of normal is the Iron Prison. So again, make sure you use a personal cooldown when it expires, stay in your assigned spot for Toxic Storm spawns, And once it starts casting, move out to the next position. So you can see here we just move about 20 or 25 yards away every time storm appears, and then repeat the process. Once the oozes start to appear, your tank should kite them out, as you'll see here in a moment. And if you're ranged DPS, make sure you DPS them down quickly so that they don't get close to anyone else, don't danger anyone. But again, that's just like the normal version. And that's it. You can repeat this process ad nauseum as long as necessary, and you should be able to really maintain significant DPS on Kardris, even as in melee or a range, depending what you are. So that is the entire strategy for the DPS guide for Heroic Kor'kron Dark Shaman. For DPS, it's pretty simple. This fight is mostly a matter of healing, to be quite honest, especially if you're using the split method. So mostly be up to your healers on the Haromm group to deal with the damage up there. And once they get it down, everyone else, as long as they're managing their prison cooldowns and the positioning for storms, should be able to deal with Kardris just fine. That should cover everything. So as always, good luck, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe.